your own podcast, moving up in the world. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Hey everybody, this is Razib here, and I am here with Dr. Eric Cline. And I think most of the people listening will know Dr. Cline from his book 1177, about the year 1177. And so I just want to start out why that year. What's the big deal? I mean, those of the listenership who read the book probably know, but I mean, in general for everybody else, like what would you say about that year?
So the book is about the collapse of the end of the Late Bronze Age. And that particular year, 1177 BC or BCE, is when the so-called Sea Peoples attack Egypt for the second time. And we have that as a written record by Ramses III on the wall of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. And so this becomes one of the main chronological linchpins that we can choose. So for me, it's kind of a benchmark. We're talking about the whole collapse. 1177 is one of the years that we can zoom in on.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I would ask you is, people focus on 476, when Rome fell, all that stuff. But, most scholars would probably say, well, I mean, that year is just a year. It's just kind of a signpost. And there were more, they're gradualists, they're, punctuationists, I don't know. But it's not like it just happened in that one year. And so are you just saying that it's a good anchor point around which we can talk about the general dynamic processes that were occurring in those decades that led to the unwinding of those civilizations?
That's exactly what it is. It's academic shorthand, if you want to put it that way. I mean, you just mentioned 476 as the fall of the Roman Empire, which is what we teach the kids back in sixth grade and 10th grade. And we all know that Rome didn't actually fall in that year. In fact, it took most of the 5th century. And even after that, you've still got the Eastern Roman Empire survives for another 1,000 years. So we've got something similar that's happening in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Late Bronze Age. And that is, it did not collapse. It did not collapse in 1177. That's the title that my editor suggested. It took more than a century for the entire Bronze Age to come to an end. If you want to talk about being a gradualist, I guess I fall into that category. And what I would argue, and what I told my editor, is that a better way to phrase it is that life in 1200 BC was very different from life in 1100 and extremely different in 1000 BC. And then he said, well, that might be true, but that's not a good title, which is quite true. So, so I spent a fair amount of the book at the end kind of arguing against my own title, if that makes sense. And so I would completely agree. It is an arbitrary year, and yet it is representative. So in the end, I actually basically say 1177 is to the end of the Bronze Age, as 476 is to the fall of Rome. Neither of them are quite accurate, and yet everyone knows what we're talking about when we use those numbers.
Hmm. Well, I mean, everyone is depends on how you define everyone. So, let's take a step back. I when I was a kid, I read Jacques Hawks and other scholars. I was really interested in the Mycenaeans, partly because I watched the 1980s PBS special with I think Michael Wood in Search of the Trojan War.
Oh
So,
man, that is the best thing. That is the best program. Yes.
okay, well, I mean, if people are curious, they should actually look it up on YouTube. It's totally freely available. I checked one time just out of curiosity, but yeah, it's a really great special. I would recommend it. Can you give the listener a general framework on which societies were around, and adjust the whole international scene in the Eastern Mediterranean at say like the peak of the end of the Bronze Age before this time of tumult you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So, what we were just referring to, Michael Wood did a series, it's a six-part series, In Search of the Trojan War, and it's the absolute best thing. I actually use it in the class I teach on Troy and the Trojan War. And he wrote a book based on it as well, which came out in the 80s. But the Trojan War is just part of what we're talking about here. It is part of the collapse. But when we're talking about the collapse of the late Bronze Age, we are actually talking about a very specific area of the world. We're talking about the Aegean in particular, that is Greece, mainland Greece and Crete and the islands. We're also talking about the Western Mediterranean, Italy, Sicily, Sardinia. But especially we're talking about Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. So the groups and the areas, we've got Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, we've got Minoans on Crete, we have Cypriots on the island of Cyprus, Hittites in ancient Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey. We have Canaanites in the Levant, that would be in modern terms Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Egyptians, obviously, in Egypt. And then over in Mesopotamia, which would be modern day Iraq and kind of northern Syria, we've got Babylonians, we've got Assyrians, we've got Mitanni, and those are the ones that are involved in what I've called a globalized society during the late Bronze Age, which would be 1700 down to 1200 BC. And I use globalized advisedly. It's not, like today where something in Japan affects New York City 10 seconds later on the stock market. But if you're going in an area, say in modern terms, from Italy on one end to Afghanistan on the other, and from Turkey down to Egypt, they were all in contact. It was an international period. They had diplomatic embassies, they had treaties, they had trade, and actually, none of them were self sufficient. They were all dependent upon each other to a certain extent. So, when one goes down at about 1200 BC or just afterward, it affects the others. So the Hittites collapsing affects the Mycenaeans and the Cypriots and the Assyrians. Egyptians going down, they withdraw from Canaan. And so it's kind of like a domino effect. And that's what we've got. When I talk about a collapse, I'm talking about the collapse of the whole world system, as it were. The life that they had known it for a good 300, 400, 500 years comes to an end. There are portions that survive, and we'll talk about this, that transform, that have resilience, that make it into the Iron Age. But the Bronze Age world in this region, as they knew it, comes to a kind of a sudden crashing halt right after 1200 BC. So that's the area we're talking about, and those are some of the different cultures that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I read a book about, I think about 10 years ago now. Some listeners might be interested. Brotherhood of Kings, How International Relations Shaped the Ancient Near East by Amanda Padani. So I don't know what you think of that book, Eric, but I found it very interesting. So it describes the whole world and the scene that you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. So Amanda's a good friend of mine. We've been friends for 30 years or so, and she wrote an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Yeah, it's called Brotherhood of Kings. And what she's doing is taking this exact same period that we're talking about and looking at it primarily from the viewpoint of the kings. This Brotherhood of Kings is the king of Egypt, the king of the Hittites, king of Assyria, king of the Babylonians, and even some of the, shall we call them, lesser kings, the vassal kings, the Canaanites, king of Jerusalem, king of Damascus, and so on. And she, in particular, is using some of my favorite sources from this period, namely the Amarna letters, which is an archive of royal correspondence that was kept by Amenhotep III and his heretic son Akhenaten, who may have started monotheism. They are ruling in the 14th century BC from about 1400 down to, give or take 1340 or 1330 BC, just before King Tut, if you want to put it into context. And this archive holds letters both coming from and going out to the various other great kings. So they've got correspondence with Shupiluliuma of the Hittites, for example, and Tutalias and others. So we can shed quite a bit of light on what it was like at the upper levels of society at that time, especially in terms of things like gift exchange and fabulous dowries, because very frequently the kings exchanged daughters to cement the peace treaties that they were signing. So, yeah, Amanda Podany, Brotherhood of Kings, sheds a really interesting light on this particular period.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to go back to your book, but a really quick question. That I noted here, the Hittites, they have cool names. I remember that from the documentary with Michael Wood. Uh, why were they particularly fragile? I get a sense because yeah, they're remembered in the Bible, but they're kind of gone with some of these other societies. Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, even the Greeks. The stories in the Greek myths, they're kind of remembered in a way, but it seems like the Hittites, like there's no continuity in Anatolia. Like, was that a particularly fragile case?
Yes and no. The Hittites are, I agree with you, they're absolutely fascinating, and they have some of the best names around, right? Hattushili and Mershili, and then my particular favorite, the Shupiluliuma, that I wanted to name my son that. My wife objected for some reason. I thought, Shupiluliuma Klein, there's nobody else in kindergarten named that. But it didn't work. So, but the Hittites, we know them from the Bible especially, and this actually caused some of the early explorers a bit of confusion because the Bible seems to put the Hittites down farther south than they actually were, down in what we would today call Syria, Lebanon, Israel. Whereas the actual empire of the Hittites is up in ancient Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And they're actually, that name is wrong. They're not the Hittites, they're the Neshites. That was their original kingdom, was at a place called Kotepekanesh. That's where their capital was. But they moved from Nesha to Hattusas. And so when the first explorers found them and finally figured out that these ruins in Turkey were actually the remnants of the Hittites, and the Bible had kind of misplaced them a bit. They called them the Hittites, and by the time we were able to read Hittite and decipher it and figured out they were actually the Neshites, and that's what they called themselves, it was too late. We had already given them the name of the Hittites, so the name has stuck. But before I get to your question, let me say, why did the Bible have them in the wrong place? It's because the Hittite Empire actually extended down into what we would today call northern Syria. And when the Hittite Empire proper went down at about 1200, that bit in North Syria stayed on and kept going into the Iron Age. That was the one part of the Hittites that was resilient and that transformed. It was actually a branch of the Hittite royal family. One of Shupyuludiumus's younger sons started out down there at Carchemish. And so the Neo-Hittites, as we now call them, the New Hittites, who were there in the Iron Age, those are the ones that the biblical writers knew about, and they were in the proper place, if you will. So it's kind of like, I tell my students, it's like the British Empire is no longer around, and yet people still play cricket and rugby and drink afternoon tea in places as far away as Australia and India and other places. So same thing like this. The Hittites
Hmm.
themselves are gone at the end of the Bronze Age, but the Neo-Hittites keep going. Now, in terms of fragility, that's an interesting question. They don't seem to have been any more or less fragile than anybody else, but it is true that they go down and they don't come back. They are supplanted by new groups like the Urartians and then the Scythians and the Cimmerians. One thing that I'm wondering, we know that there were major enemies up to the north of them, the Kashka, and the Kashka had already captured Hattusas back in the 14th century, and it looks like the Kashka come back down in about 1200 and put the finishing touches on the Hittites. But the capital city, Hattusa, was already abandoned at that point. And I'm wondering, it's just kind of thinking out loud here, but we know the Hittite Empire was hit by a plague about 150 years earlier, say about 1350 BC. Our friend Shuppi had attacked the Egyptians, mostly because they killed one of his sons, Zananza, and he started a war between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Hittites took some Egyptian prisoners of war back home to Hattusas, and those Egyptian prisoners of war were carrying the plague. It broke out in Hatti. It killed a huge number of people, including most of the royal family, Shuppi among them. And so, even though that plague happened 150 years earlier, I'm wondering if that might not have knocked out some of the underpinnings of upper society and all that, and weakened the Hittites so that when the final blows came, about 1200 BC, they fell perhaps more heavily and more concretely than most of the other groups. So I don't have a
Hmm.
great answer. Nobody does, but I don't think they were that much more fragile unless the plague much earlier had hurt them that much.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unfair for me to ask you that question because we're still arguing about why Rome fell. So asking about the Hittites in particular is that's a big lift. I do want to say before we move back to the general questions, why the Hittites are important. I believe the Anita text is the first recorded text in an Indo-European language, right? And so the Hittite language is Indo-European, which is pretty rare at that time in the Near East, at least in the Fertile Crescent area when they moved south, and it is the first documented evidence of this broad language family that stretches from India to Europe, and it dates. I think the Anita text is like 1750 BC or so.
Yeah, it's back there, and actually, Anita and I think it's his son, are the two that are living at Nesha before Hattushili moves the capital city to Hattusas about 1700. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It should date to about 1750, give or take. I mean, all these dates are fluid, but
Yeah.
Anita is one of the earliest people we know there.
Well, so there's this broader unwinding at the end of the Bronze Age before what the Greeks called, or what we call the Greek Dark Age, before the Classical period. So, I mean, what's your ultimate conclusion on what happened? Why, if there wasn't even a cause? Because sometimes random things happen. I mean, someone dies at a certain time, or someone lives a very long time. So, I don't want to ignore stochasticity, randomness in historical events, obviously, but I mean, what's your general take home conclusion in your book about the end of the Bronze Age?
As to what caused it, you mean? What was the smoking gun? Um,
Yeah, I mean, like, what's stuff like comets. Like, I mean, there's various things that happen, right? There's floods, there's plagues, like you mentioned. There's random things that happen, but was it inevitable that at some point its internal weaknesses or its robustness against climate shocks? I mean, what's going on here? And also, like, the Dark Age after the fall of, say, like, the Mycenaean civilization, which we know was Greek speaking, was pretty intense. The Greeks seem very vague about what happened
yeah,
before the fall. So, I mean,
right.
that's indicating like a pretty strong rupture in a kind of frail system to me.
Yeah. I mean, these are, to me, fascinating questions. This is why I like this particular period of history so much. But and part of the fascination for me is that there are no easy answers. Um, if we knew what happened exactly, it wouldn't be nearly as much. It wouldn't be nearly as interesting. These are history's mysteries. So, what caused the collapse of the Bronze Age? Not an easy question to answer. And in fact, in my book, I don't answer it. And a lot of readers have complained about that. They want the smoking gun, and my response is there is no smoking gun. There's a bunch of them because I see at the end of the Bronze Age no fewer than 5 or 6 different stressors, all of which combine to bring down this world system, these various cultures. I don't think any one of them on their own would have been enough to do it, but the combination of it resulted in not only a domino effect, but also a multiplier effect. So, for instance, We know there is climate change back then. We've got documented evidence for drought. In fact, not just a drought, but a mega drought that lasts between 150 and 300 years. There's very good evidence for that. I've actually got an updated version of 1177 that's going to come out in February. And I've collected all of the stuff that's come out since 2014. And we now have evidence for drought stretching from Italy all the way to Iran at this time period, from about 1200 down to 900 BC. So you've got scientific evidence for a drought. We've got textual evidence for a famine. People are starving everywhere from the Hittites up in Anatolia to Ugarit in northern Syria to elsewhere. We've also got archaeological evidence for earthquakes. We've got evidence, both textual and archaeological, for invaders. So you add these all up, and it becomes kind of an insurmountable difficulty. And the thing that I try and stress is no one factor was enough to overthrow everything. I mean, earthquake happens in in this region all the time, and people continue, right? A lot of people die, but the culture, the civilization continues. Same thing with invaders, same thing with drought, same thing with famine. But what happens if they happen all at the same time or in rapid succession? So then that's where the mega drought comes in. If you've got a drought for a year or 2 years or 5 years or even 10 years, that's tough. But imagine having a drought for 100 or 150 straight years. There's no way that you can recover from that, especially if you've got invaders on top of that, including migrants that have started because of the drought in their area. And then you get hit with an earthquake as well. So it was, as I call it, a perfect storm. Ironically, I don't think that this was a fragile system, not any more fragile than any other system. I think it was, I stole a line from my kids. I think it was an unfortunate series of events, or a series of unfortunate events. That is, this could happen to anybody anytime if, just the wrong things happen all at the same time. So, right up until it hit. I mean, we've got text from Ugarit in northern Syria that show that they were happily trading with the Egyptians, with the Hittites, with the Mycenaeans, right up until almost the minute that their city was annihilated, probably by invaders. There's arrowheads in the walls and bodies in the streets. So the way I kind of phrase it to my students is everything was going along really well until suddenly it wasn't. And so I've been trying for the longest time to figure out, did they even know they were collapsing at the time they were collapsing? And is there anything they could have done to stop it? Could they have, I don't know what. I mean, today we would do like agent-based modeling and try and figure out, if you do this, would this happen and this and with. The
Hmm.
conclusion that I come to is, first of all, they didn't really know it was happening, not on a worldwide, or a world system. And also, I'm not sure there was anything that they could have done to stop it.
Yeah, I do wonder if 3,000 years from now there will be people recording podcasts on a planet far away in a different star system, wondering if we knew what was happening right now about the collapse of our civilization.
Yeah.
But
Uh,
in any case, you did mention the sea peoples. I do have to bring them up because a lot of people want to know about the sea peoples. They're very romantic and sexy and interesting, and I think there was at least one full episode of this Michael Wood documentary that we're talking about devoted to the sea peoples. um, can you tell us a little bit about the sea peoples? And I don't know, have you seen? I'm pretty sure you've seen the genetic work that came out in Science. I think it was last year by Michael Feldman. Ancient DNA sheds light on the genetic origins of early Iron Age Philistines. So, as a geneticist, I do want to get into the genetics a little bit, but can you talk about the sea peoples and why they're such a big deal?
yes, absolutely. Sea peoples are absolutely fascinating. And the article by Mikhail Feldman and the others in Science Advances came out in July 2019. and it may have shed light on at least one of the groups of the Sea People. So to back up, we know of them from the Egyptian record, particularly the one that I mentioned at the top of the show, from Ramses III at Medinet Habu. But that's the second time they attack Egypt. They come in 30 years earlier, 3 decades earlier, in 1207 BC, during the reign of the pharaoh Merneptah. And between Merneptah and Ramses III, they mention something like 9 different groups by name that we now lump together under the designation of Sea Peoples. And they name them specifically the Shardana, the Shekelesh, the Peleset, the Ekwesh, the Denyen, and so on. And we've been playing a linguistic game ever since, oh boy, ever since about 1850 or 1860 is when they first were deciphered. And in fact, Champollion, the guy that deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, he had already suggested that the Peleset are the Philistines, and that's the one that we accept. But the others we're not sure about. The Shardana, that sounds an awful lot like Sardinia, so people suggest that's where they came from. The Shekelesh might be from Sicily. The Ekwesh could be the Achaeans, that is Homer's Mycenaeans, and so on. So we know of them from these Egyptian records, but we don't know of them from anywhere else. We have never found a site that belongs to them in terms of where they originated. We've never found a site really that belongs to them from where they got settled down by the Egyptians after they lost. There are some texts like the Tale of Wenamun that mentions Tel Dor in what is now modern Israel, which was Canaan back then. And he calls Dor a Tejeker town, which would have been one of the Sea Peoples. So when I was in school, back in college and graduate school, I was always told that the Sea Peoples were probably the main reason for the collapse of the Bronze Age, and everything was laid at their feet. Now, additional studies have shown that they're probably not the main reason. They are one of the reasons, but some have suggested that they were as much victims as oppressors, and that they are just a sign of the times, that they start moving because of the drought. And we know there was a drought, for instance, in northern Italy at about 1200. And so they are kind of more a symptom rather than the cause. But there's always been a debate as to where they came from and where they ended up. And that's where the genetic material from Ashkelon that you mentioned comes in. Because at Ashkelon, which Harvard's been excavating for more than 30 years, they found a Philistine cemetery a couple of years ago. And they excavated it and did DNA testing on some of the skeletons in that cemetery. But they also tested some skeletons that had been found a little bit earlier of infants that were buried underneath the floors of some of the houses. And these date, if I'm not mistaken, to the late 12th or into the 11th century BC, but they are all buried with identifiable Philistine pottery. Now, I have to say that Philistine pottery looks a lot like Mycenaean pottery. Sorry about that. Philistine pottery looks a lot like Mycenaean pottery, as if the refugees from mainland Greece have come over and settled down and are now making their usual pottery, but with local clay. So it's long been suspected that the Philistines may actually be refugee Mycenaeans. So anyway, in this cemetery and in the houses where these kids are, there are distinctive Philistine jars, vessels, stirrup jars, other things. So we know they're Philistine. The DNA of the 4 kids that was tested came out very interestingly, showing that they were a mixture of local Canaanite and non-local peoples. Almost a 50-50, not quite, but and the non-local people, they did the modeling, and the models that most closely fit it suggest that that part of their DNA comes from either Crete or mainland Greece, or even all the way over in Iberia, that is basically modern day Spain. Now, the kids that they're testing, since they're later 12th or into the 11th century, they're obviously not sea peoples themselves. They are probably, I'm guessing, the grandchildren of the original sea peoples, the original Philistines. And that would mean that they did settle down, that they did assimilate, as it were, and intermarried with the local Canaanite population, which archaeologists have been suggesting for some time now, and that these grandkids then are showing the mixture of local and non-local. Interestingly, though, there are some skeletons that date later than that, and by that point, they are showing almost a reversion back to completely local. So it looks like that this is almost a momentary blip, if you will, but it's enough for me to go, hey, maybe we're right. Maybe the Philistines do come from Greece or the Western Mediterranean. And of course, the Bible does say the Philistines come from Kaftor. So if you want to use the Bible as a source, you can use that also. So there's lots of things here, but I'm very, very wary, as of course you are with genetics, that testing for individuals is not a large enough sample. So we need to do more testing. We need more of these individuals. But this is the beginning, I think, of being able to put all of this on a more scientific basis. So we may eventually figure out who the sea peoples are and where they come from. But in the meantime, if I ever have a choice, if somebody gives me $1 million, I was asked this in another interview, if somebody gave me $1 million, where would I go dig? And my answer was somewhere in Sicily and Sardinia, looking for the original sea peoples.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one thing we do have to say is, sometimes genetic evidence is surprising and it emerges almost in a vacuum. And so, if you read those papers, there's a lot of hand waving and a lot of speculation because there's not much, other stuff to go on. This is a situation where we have a huge body of scholarship, a lot of circumstantial evidence, archaeology, the textual evidence from the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. And, the Egyptian sources that you're talking about. So I think the great thing about this is it's so multidisciplinary and it kind of amplifies and builds on what was already there. And so I think, yeah, like we're a fair amount of the way to understanding at least who these sea peoples were, because I think we kind of already suspected that they had some sort of a gene connection. It's like, lo and behold, they possibly might genetically. And I do have to say also, there's some work out of Crusader areas in Lebanon, which also shows a temporary genetic change and then it kind of reverted back. So it's not going to be the last time that this happens in the Levant, where outsiders show up, make a huge cultural change, and then they don't leave a long-term imprint. So I'm not entirely shocked by that. In a change of pace, I do have a question for you because you are an archaeologist and you know this stuff, and I do not. There is a fair amount of genetic evidence now that between 4 and 5,000 years ago, so say between 2000 and 3000 BC, there looks like a pulse of gene flow, some ancestry that's related to people in, say, central to eastern Anatolia that shows up in Crete, in Greece, and now the most recent work is it also shows up in Sicily. And it's associated with particular haplogroups that are common in the region now too, as haplogroup J. But I'm just wondering, like, do you have any idea what this could be? Because it seems like a pulse that goes from Anatolia, sweeps across the southern Balkans, and goes into Sicily during this early period. And obviously, we don't have history, we don't have records. What would an archaeologist say to trying to get at this
Well,
question?
we do seem to have a couple of periods of change. And one thing that comes to mind immediately is towards the end of the early Bronze Age. In Greece, this would be early Helladic II period. Let's say 2300 BC down to about maybe 2100 BC. We see a fair number of changes there, and it looks like maybe even new peoples come in. new other inventions. Um, but we also see, well, like over in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's also another period of a mega drought that Harvey Weiss and others have worked on. So there are definitely changes that are taking place between, well, I would say a little over 4,000 years ago. But it definitely looks like, as you said, there are people that are moving around, that are migrating between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. And bear in mind, that's the third millennium BC. And that's when we get a lot of things that are starting. You get, technically speaking, the beginning of civilization in both Mesopotamia and in Egypt by about 3,000 BC, which would be 5,000 years ago. You get the invention of writing in both of those areas with hieroglyphics and cuneiform. But you also get things like the invention of bronze, which really starts up in about 3000 BC, where they would put 90% copper and 10% tin together. So there is a lot happening in the third millennium BC. But then, as I said, towards the end of it, we get other changes as well, and invasions and changes from about, yeah, give or take 2200 BC. So I would probably link that archaeological data to the genetic data that you're talking about and say that something is going on. And it may well be that it is linked to the mega drought that has been identified not just in Mesopotamia at about the same time period, but Harvey Weiss and others have argued that this actually may have been worldwide at that time. I think they've detected that mega drought at the end of the early Bronze Age in all continents of the world, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you are talking about climate change starting migrations at the end of the late Bronze Age, there's no reason to think it wouldn't have happened at the end of the early Bronze Age as well. So, long answer to your question, but they may all be related back then in the third millennium also. Yes.
All right. Well, we're talking about this period and the mega drought. One thing that I recently read was about the spread of the Indicus cattle into the Near East around 2000 BC. It's all tourists. It's all the West Asian, European before that, and so they've been correlating that with ancient DNA. They see like all of a sudden it just shows up in the Levant all over the place around 2000 BC. And this brings me to the question of connections between South Asia and West Asia during the Bronze Age and the fall of the Indus Valley civilization or its decline. Do you know much about the extent of contact and how clear we are that the contact just kind of ended? Because that's what I've read. I don't really know much about this topic, but it's kind of a question that's been on my mind, partly due to this issue related to cattle, which show up after 2000 BC all of a sudden, or Indian cattle that with the zebu
Right,
cattle.
right. And yeah, it happens then. It also happens more deliberately at the end of the late Bronze Age, where Israel Finkelstein and a couple of others just uh, published an article saying that the Egyptians are and Canaanites are deliberately crossbreeding cattle to account for a drought round about 1200 BC. So this seems to happen a couple of different times. But yeah, in terms of the connections, this actually takes me back to the beginning of graduate school when I was studying third millennium trade between Mesopotamia and South Asia. So back in the third millennium and into the early second, there were definitely connections between the people, say, in Mesopotamia and those over in Bahrain and the Oman Peninsula, which they called Dilmun and Magan and Malucha. There were also connections with Afghanistan and with India, including with the Harappan civilization there. And we've got a number of different trade goods that are mentioned in the Mesopotamian text, as well as imported objects. And of course, they're already getting tin and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan back in the third millennium and into the early second. But things do change. For instance, the connections with the area that we would today call India seem to have kind of suddenly decreased, in part because the Harappan civilization collapses around the year 1900 BC, give or take. It may actually be connected with that earlier mega drought at the end of the third millennium. So a lot of people actually ask me or post on YouTube or wherever, why aren't you talking about the Harappan civilization in 1200? And my answer is very simply because they're not really around anymore. They've been replaced, but they're not a major player. But there are still connections that continue throughout the second millennium, especially with Afghanistan, where they're still getting tin and lapis lazuli right up until the end of the late Bronze Age. But there's also been more recent evidence of connections. So, for example, at Megiddo, in a Middle Bronze Age tomb, that would be somewhere around 1700 BC, maybe a little bit later. In one of the jars and bowls there, they recently found traces of vanilla that would have more than likely come from farther east, than India, over into South Asia. And also, a couple of years ago, there were traces of cinnamon that were found in a small Phoenician Iron Age flask that was found in modern Israel. So they may have been importing things like spices and other perishable items that are very hard to trace. They may have been importing those as well. And the only way that we're going to find those is through the new scientific techniques like organic residue analysis. Because otherwise, you're just looking at a bowl, you're looking in a jar, and you can't see anything. But if you do organic residue analysis, you can say, the bowl originally held various things, including vanilla extract or including traces of cinnamon. So this is one of the ways that our investigations of the Bronze Age is going to continue. But to go back to your question, that means that we definitely have connections between, say, West Asia and South Asia back in the third millennium and right through the second millennium, but they ebb and flow as the various civilizations ebb and flow themselves. And there's a lot we still don't know. For instance, I was trying to figure out at one point, who was it that was in Afghanistan at that time that was mining the tin that they were then exporting out to all of our people in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is that we actually don't know that much about them. There are some people that are excavating that area. And if it's ever safe to go there, I would love to go and dig in that region and find out more about who was there mining the tin, especially in the second millennium.
Yeah, so I mean, this brings me to my next question. Just like, what are you excited about future directions? I mean, mostly in science, it's always like, what's the question? Like, what are the unsolved mysteries? Like, I mean, what are you thinking for the 2020s? I guess, like we're in that decade now.
Right. It's going to be scientific advances, just to put it simply. It's going to be using DNA. It's going to be using organic residue analysis. It's going to be using what Israel Finkelstein calls the exact life sciences. It's in effect microarchaeology. You're looking at the minute parts, you're looking at the scientific parts. We're always going to be digging probably the same way with trowels and pickaxes and such, but our modes of investigation and our modes of trying to figure out, especially in terms of perishable goods that we otherwise don't know anything about except from writing, from the text, that's going to be the advances. So it's big time science. And that's why archaeologists have always partnered with other disciplines, but we're doing so even more today. So archaeogeneticists is now a thing, and we're getting people working on that. So stable isotope analysis, strontium analysis, things that can tell us just by looking at the teeth where they grew up for the first 5 years of their life. That's going to be where we're going in the future. So basically, after we've dug it up, what are we going to do with it then? And that's where the science comes in to tell us more about what we've just excavated. And for me, that's extremely exciting. That's the next set of advances, along with more advances in remote sensing. How we look through trees that are blocking the Maya, for example, in Belize or Honduras, or blocking things like in Cambodia, where the trees are so dense you can't see the ancient ruins. But also, we've got LIDAR that can do that already, but there'll be other things as well. And in terms of peering through the earth, we've got already magnetometers and gradiometers and electrical resistivity and other types of remote sensing that let us look down into the site before we ever begin digging. And I think there's going to be more advances there, so that, not only is doing archaeology time and money, but it's also destruction. Because when we excavate something, that's it. Nobody else can come along and excavate the same thing unless we've left a little bit for them. So if we can do a lot of our work through remote sensing and not actually dig until we are trying to corroborate what we think we see in the images, that will be a great advance as well. So it's an amazing time to be an archaeologist, but I actually think the best is yet to come. And I would encourage anybody out there in a related science that might be able to contribute to contact your local nearest friendly archaeologist and say, I'm a specialist in X. Do you think I can help you in any way?
All right. So my last question, the next book, what's it on? When's it coming out?
So the next book is on what happened. Right? Okay, you've collapsed. What next? And it's called After 1177, The Rebirth of Civilizations. And what I'm doing is really looking at what did they do? How did they come back, or how did they not come back? We've already referred to this slightly in passing above. But what I'm doing is taking a look at what happened in Greece, what happened to the Mycenaeans, what happened to the Minoans, what happened in Anatolia, what happened to the Hittites, right? What happened to the Syrians, the Babylonians, all of our friends that collapsed in the late Bronze Age, what happened to them? And I'm framing it in terms of resilience and transformation. Because the thing is that, yes, there is a collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age. The life as they knew it came to an end. Their globalized world system, where all the great kings are writing to each other, that comes to a sudden halt. But life does not end. And the civilizations and cultures don't always end. In fact, individual pieces survived, but to differing extents. So some were resilient, like the Assyrians. They actually hold on for almost a century before they go down for like 200 years and then pop back up again. So there's resilience with the Assyrians. There's transformation. The Cypriots, they transformed their entire society in order to survive. Some of them completely collapsed. We mentioned the Hittites. They're gone. They're replaced by the Urartians. Same with the Mycenaean Greeks and the Minoans on Crete. They're gone completely. But other bits survive, even the Hittites, even though they went down. Like I said, a branch of the royal family survives in North Syria as the Neo-Hittites. In Canaan, well, most of the Canaanites go away and they're replaced by people like the Israelites and the Moabites and the Edomites. But some, like in the Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Byblos, they not only survive, they flourish. Talib has recently used a term called anti-fragile, where he says in times of crisis, this group flourishes. And that's what the Phoenicians did. And in fact, the Phoenicians helped everybody else come back up. The Greeks go down, the Mycenaeans go down so hard that it really takes them a couple hundred years to come back up. But it's, I think, with the Phoenician assistance, Phoenicians bring the alphabet to Greece. They also start bringing trade goods. So this is what I'm exploring in this next book, is what actually happened during the Iron Age. And of course, our other name for that period, this is about 400 years. I'm going from 1176 to 776. This is what we call the Dark Ages. And my conclusion, actually, and this will be no surprise to the archaeologist, it's not as dark as it was once thought. In fact, some areas bounce back within 100 years. Others take up to 300 years to bounce back. And then it is a completely different world. It does reunite, it does become globalized again, but not until almost 800 BC. And in a different form. You don't have these huge empires, the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Mycenaeans. Mostly you have little city-states until the Assyrians show back up in the 9th century. And then you've got the Neo-Assyrian Empire, followed by the Neo-Babylonian, and so on and so forth. So I'm looking, is it really a dark age? No, probably not. But everything was different depending on where you were. So I'm essentially looking at these as a series of case studies. What happened when the Mycenaeans collapsed? What happened when the Hittites collapsed? And so on. But I'm writing it the same way I did 1177. I decided it's better to go chronologically. So each of the chapters are a century. So 12th century, 11th century, 10th century, 9th century, ending in the 8th century. And I've arbitrarily picked the year 776 to end, mostly because it's 400 years later. But also, as some people will know, that's the year of the first Olympics in Greece. So it just seemed to me it was a nice ending time right there. But I'm also getting rid of, I think, what one might call sacred cows along the way, not only saying this isn't as dark an age as we thought, but also getting rid of the Dorians. Right? Archaeologists have known this for quite a long time, but the general public really doesn't. There's no Dorian invasion. It didn't happen. It doesn't exist. There are migrations, which would make sense because, in fact, Linear B, the language that the Mycenaeans are writing in, there's a new recent study showing that there's actually Doric words in Linear B. So, no Dorian invasion. Forget that. They come in migrating during the Iron Age. So, anyway, I hope it's of interest to a lot of people. It's certainly been fascinating to me because a lot of people study this stuff compartmentalized, right? They study the Greeks, they study the Neo-Assyrians or the Babylonians. Very rarely do you get something where it's all put together. And indeed, I've never done it for the Iron Age. I had long done it for the Bronze Age, but this is the first time, from my point of view, that I'm putting together all of these different areas and looking, what are they all doing in the 11th century? What's happening in the 10th century? And I can tell you, for me, it's been eye-opening. I thought I knew it, and I did to a certain extent, but I'm learning an awful lot, and I'm hoping that I can convey that to the readers in a manageable way, trying to tell the stories and the history. But there is so much history at this time period because we've got a lot of writing from the first centuries of the first millennium BC. So I'm excited about it. It's going to take a little while more. My deadline's not even until December of next year. So I think we're going to be looking for it 2022, maybe something like that. So I'm putting out the update of 1177 first this February, and then there'll be the sequel a year or so later. But anyway, I'm having a lot of fun researching and writing it, and I'm hoping that people will enjoy reading it and finding out what happened after the collapse. And of course, as always, I'm hopeful that there are some lessons for us today, right? Not that we're necessarily going to collapse today, But what if we do? It might be useful to learn from the past as to how they dealt with it after they collapsed and see if there's anything useful for us today.
All right. It's been great talking to you, Eric. I think with that, I will end this, but maybe we will have a conversation in 2022 about the
I
next
would
book.
love that. Would absolutely welcome it. Thank you.
This podcast for kids.